Because here is what $21 billion has not bought. It has not bought American influence over Israeli military decisions. It has not bought compliance with American requests on civilian access. And it has not bought the political outcomes that American officials say they want. That point may have already passed. In May 2026, a flotilla of ships sailed toward Gaza. It was intercepted. The activists were detained. The cargo never arrived. This has now happened every single time since 2010. The people who sailed took real risk for a moral cause, but that is not what this video is about. This video is about what the interception of those ships reveals about America's most expensive and least examined foreign policy commitment. Not expensive in the way politicians mean when they talk about cost. Expensive in a way that is harder to see, and far harder to reverse. Because the United States has spent more than $21 billion in military aid to Israel since October 2023 alone. And the question almost nobody is asking is, what has that bought? Not morally, strategically, what has America actually gotten for the most unconditional alliance in its modern foreign policy history? Let's start with what the money has bought. Israel's military capability is real. Its intelligence infrastructure is real. Its value as a regional partner is real. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the current arrangement, unconditional, unqualified, without leverage, is actually serving American strategic interests, or whether it has become its own kind of trap. Because here is what $21 billion has not bought. It has not bought American influence over Israeli military decisions. It has not bought compliance with American requests on civilian access. And it has not bought the political outcomes that American officials say they want. Foreign Affairs put it plainly in 2026. Washington has struggled without success to shape Israel's conduct of this war, despite providing nearly unconditional diplomatic and military support. That is not a criticism of the alliance. It is a description of what an alliance without leverage actually produces. And it is a problem that no one in Washington wants to say out loud. Because the logic of unconditional support is that it builds trust and deepens partnership. But there is a point at which unconditional support stops being an alliance and starts being a blank check that the recipient no longer needs to earn. That point may have already passed. And the flotilla, those ships, those activists, that interception in international waters is one of the clearest symptoms of what happens when it does. Because the interception of humanitarian ships is not just a legal question, it is a diplomatic cost, and America is paying that cost without having authorized it. Let's talk about the costs that do not appear in the military aid budget, the diplomatic costs, the reputational costs, the strategic costs that compound over time. Colombia expelled Israeli diplomats and canceled a trade deal with Israel the day the flotilla was intercepted. Turkey called it an act of terrorism. Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia condemned it. Ireland, Spain, France demanded explanations. None of those countries directed their anger solely at Israel. They directed it at the architecture that makes Israeli actions possible, and America is the most visible pillar of that architecture. When America vetoes UN Security Council resolutions, which it has done 42 times to protect Israel, it is not a neutral act. It is a choice. And every veto has a price that is paid somewhere else in the world. That price is measured in relationships that become harder to maintain, in coalitions that become harder to build, in credibility that becomes harder to spend on the next crisis that has nothing to do with Gaza. Gallup measured American public support for Israel at its lowest point in 2025 since polling began in 2001, and the Chicago Council found Israel's favorability at its lowest since their surveys began in 1978. This is not just a demographic problem, it is a structural problem. The domestic political coalition that has sustained this alliance for 30 years is fracturing faster than anyone in Washington is willing to acknowledge. Which means the alliance as currently structured may not survive its own political base. And yet, the policy continues unchanged. The aid flows, the vetoes continue, the blank check remains, while the costs pile up in places that budget spreadsheets do not capture. Does it mean supporting Israel's right to exist? That is not controversial. Does it mean supporting every military decision Israel makes in the conduct of this war? That is a completely different commitment, and Americans have been sold the first one while paying for the second. That distinction is not a detail, it is the entire problem. Because Netanyahu, who has been in power through multiple American administrations, has consistently treated American support as unconditional, and American administrations have consistently confirmed that he is right. The result is an alliance where one partner sets the terms, and the other partner pays them. The Trump administration cut a deal with the Houthis to stop attacking American ships, even as the Houthis continued attacking Israeli ships. When asked to justify it, the U.S. ambassador to Israel said clearly, "Keeping Americans safe is a U.S. priority. Keeping Israelis safe is not." That statement did not end the alliance, but it revealed something that has been true for longer than anyone admitted. American and Israeli strategic interests are not always identical. They have simply been treated as if they were. Netanyahu himself said in early 2026 that he aims to reduce Israeli dependence on the United States to zero, not because the alliance is failing, but because he sees what is coming and is preparing for it. An ally that is preparing for independence is not an ally that is aligned with your interests. It is an ally that is managing its own transition, and America is funding that transition while calling it partnership. That is not support. That is subsidy. And subsidies without conditions rarely produce the behavior they are meant to. The flotilla is not the cause of this problem. It is a symptom. Every ship that is intercepted in international waters with American-made weapons and American diplomatic cover is a data point in a much larger calculation that America is not doing. Because that calculation requires asking what unconditional support is actually supposed to produce, and whether it is producing it. Israel has the right to security. That is not the question. The question is whether the current arrangement, $21 billion, 42 vetoes, unconditional diplomatic backing, is making Israel more secure, or whether it is making the conditions for durable security less likely. Because security that depends on permanent American military aid and diplomatic cover is not sovereignty. It is a different kind of dependency. And an America that cannot say no to its closest ally is not a superpower exercising judgment. It is a superpower that has outsourced a critical part of its foreign policy to someone else's domestic politics. And that is not what either country actually needs from this alliance. None of this is an argument that America should abandon Israel. It is an argument that abandoning judgment is not the same thing as loyalty. Real allies tell each other when a strategy is not working. Real allies use leverage not to punish, but to produce outcomes that serve both of their interests. Real allies do not write blank checks and call it friendship. The most pro-Israel position an American can take in 2026 is to ask whether current American policy is actually making Israel safer, or whether it is making the conditions for a durable Israeli future harder to achieve. Because an Israel that is diplomatically isolated, that has strained relations with Europe, that is losing the American public one generational cohort at a time, that is not a more secure Israel, that is a more vulnerable one. And American policy, as currently structured, is accelerating that vulnerability while calling it support. The flotilla will happen again. Another ship will sail. Another interception will generate outrage. Another round of diplomatic damage will be absorbed and moved past, and the underlying problem will remain unchanged. Because no one with the power to change it is currently asking the right question. So the better question is not, do you support Israel? The better question is, what does real support look like? And is what America is doing right now actually that? If Americans want to think seriously about this alliance, not just perform loyalty to it, they have to be willing to ask what it is producing and for whom. That is not disloyalty. That is the minimum standard of strategic thinking that any serious ally owes to the relationship it claims to value. Because the hardest thing about a relationship built on unconditional support is not maintaining it. It is admitting when the conditions have changed. And the right question, the one that actually matters for both countries' futures, is not whether to support Israel. It is what supporting Israel should actually require.